Welcome to Serial Killer Files, where we pull back the curtain on the most twisted minds in criminal history. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're heading back to a time before DNA, before modern forensics, back when a warm smile and a white uniform were all it took to be trusted with your life. But what happens when that trust becomes a weapon? It's the turn of the 20th century. The streets of Massachusetts are lined with horse-drawn carriages, flickering gas lamps, and the quiet grief of families losing loved ones to illness. But in one hospital ward after another, a chilling pattern is beginning to emerge. Patients who seem to be improving suddenly die, always under the care of one nurse, Jane Toppan. She was known as Jolly Jane, bright-eyed, well-liked, and always ready with a comforting touch. But behind that nurse's cap was a killer whose motivations defied logic and exposed the terrifying ease with which evil can hide behind compassion. You see, Jane didn't kill for greed. She didn't kill for revenge. She killed because she liked it. She once said it gave her a thrill to bring someone to the brink of death, just to pull them back, only to push them over the edge again. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even about control. It was about pleasure. Today, we're dissecting the life of a woman who called herself a harmless lunatic, but who history now remembers as one of America's most prolific female serial killers. We'll follow her journey from orphaned servant girl to medical monster, explore how she manipulated science to become an angel of death, and ask the question no one wanted to face at the time. How many more victims were there that we'll never know about? So sit tight, stay alert, and trust no one in white. Because once you learn the truth about Jolly Jane, you'll never look at a nurse the same way again. To understand the monster Jane Toppan became, we must first understand the broken child she once was. Born Honora Kelly, Jane's story begins not with privilege or opportunity, but with abandonment and profound emotional neglect. What psychologists would now recognize as a textbook case of childhood trauma that can warp a developing mind. Honora's father was an abusive, illiterate alcoholic whose descent into madness was so complete that he was eventually institutionalized. After her mother's death, this broken man made a decision that would echo through the corridors of criminal history. He placed both his daughters into an orphanage and simply disappeared. He never returned, never looked back, never gave them another thought. Imagine, if you will, a young girl, barely old enough to understand loss, suddenly thrust into a world without nurturing, without safety, without the basic human connection that shapes our capacity for empathy. This brutal rupture from family didn't just wound Honora. It fundamentally altered her psychological landscape. At age 5, fate seemed to offer a reprieve. The English Protestant Toppan family adopted her, renaming her Jane Toppan. But here's where the story takes a particularly twisted turn. This wasn't adoption as we understand it today. This was indentured adoption, meaning Jane could be returned to the asylum like a defective product if the family wasn't satisfied with her performance. The Toppans, ashamed of Jane's Irish heritage, fabricated an entirely new identity for her. They told people she was an Italian orphan whose parents had perished at sea, a story crafted around her dark hair, olive skin, and brown eyes. Being Irish was considered shameful, and Jane's stepmother, Anne Toppan, whom Jane called Auntie, constantly reminded her that being born Irish didn't mean she had to act Irish. But perhaps most damaging of all was how Jane was treated within the household. Despite carrying the Toppan name, she was never truly accepted as family. She was treated more like domestic help than a daughter, a living reminder of charity extended but never fully embraced. Anne Toppan was a strict disciplinarian who showed Jane little warmth or affection, reinforcing the child's sense that she was fundamentally different, lesser, unwanted. Now here's where Jane's story becomes particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. Rather than withdrawing or becoming obviously troubled, she developed something far more dangerous: a masterful ability to charm and manipulate. Jane's schoolmates remembered her as the life of the party. She was sociable, well-liked, always present at picnics, skating parties, and social gatherings. But even then, there were warning signs that no one recognized. Jane was known for telling extravagant lies about herself and her family. Not small fibs, but elaborate fantasies that hinted at a massive disconnect between her desires and reality. She was learning, even as a teenager, to wear a mask, to present a version of herself that people would love, while hiding the growing darkness within. This duality, outwardly charming but inwardly disturbed, would become her signature trait and the key to her later crimes. When Anne Toppan died, the final insult came in the form of a will that left the estate to her 2 biological daughters, but made no mention of Jane whatsoever. Jane continued living in the house, now under the care of Elizabeth, who had inherited it. Unlike her mother, Elizabeth treated Jane with genuine kindness and respect, perhaps the first real affection Jane had ever experienced. When Elizabeth married church deacon Ormel Brigham, Jane remained in the household as their maid. Despite the Brighams' kindness, tensions eventually led to Jane leaving the only home she had known for nearly 2 decades. It was 1885. Jane was 33 years old, and she was about to embark on a career that would give her unprecedented access to vulnerable victims. At 33, Jane faced limited options. The respectable careers available to single women, schoolteacher, seamstress, housemaid, textile worker, none appealed to her lofty ambitions. But nursing offered something different. Nursing offered power over life and death. In 1887, Jane was accepted into the Cambridge Hospital Nursing School in Boston. It was here, in the sterile corridors of medicine, that Jane Toppan would discover her true calling, and it had nothing to do with healing. Jane later confessed that it was during this period, around age 30, that a thought struck her, though she claimed not to know its origin. She realized that taking lives could be remarkably simple with substances like morphine and atropine, the very medications prescribed by physicians. Her initial experiments on a few patients proved the drug's efficiency in silent killing, raising no suspicion from overworked doctors and stressed hospital staff. But here's what makes Jane's crimes particularly chilling. She wasn't killing out of mercy, anger, or even financial gain. Jane had discovered something far more disturbing. She was addicted to the act of murder itself. She found voluptuous delight, a veiled reference to sexual pleasure in the language of her era, in watching her victims die. In her own words, Jane would stand by patients' bedsides, gazing into their eyes as the light faded, watching their pupils dilate and contract, listening as their breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. She had found her ultimate source of power and control. What made Jane Toppan particularly dangerous was her methodical approach to murder. When investigators later searched her possessions, they found a collection of well-used medical textbooks with pages particularly worn on topics covering poisons and dangerous drugs. This wasn't random killing. This was studied, deliberate experimentation on human subjects. Jane's weapon of choice was a deadly combination of morphine and atropine, drugs with starkly opposing effects that created a horrifying dance of death. Morphine would sedate and depress bodily functions, leading victims toward coma. Atropine would do the opposite, causing pupil dilation, elevated heart rate, and muscle spasms. Jane found sadistic pleasure in administering morphine to induce a coma, then reviving her victims with atropine, only to send them spiraling toward death shortly after. She was literally playing God, controlling the rhythm of life and death while watching her victims' physiological responses like some macabre performance. This constant switching between drugs created symptoms that baffled medical professionals. Doctors couldn't detect any recognizable pattern, which perfectly diverted suspicion from the charming nurse who was always so helpful, so caring, so devastated by her patients' mysterious deaths. During her time at Cambridge Hospital, Jane estimated she experimented on approximately a dozen patients. They weren't people to her. In hospital wards, they were identified only by numbers, not names. Some patients under her care actually survived, nursed back from serious illnesses like typhoid fever, which only added to her cover. Why would anyone suspect a nurse who also saved lives? Of all Jane's victims, only one documented survivor exists, and her testimony provides perhaps the most disturbing insight into Jane's psychological state. Amelia Finney was suffering from a uterine ulcer when she encountered Jane, who offered her a restorative drink. After consuming the liquid, Finney felt her consciousness slipping away. What happened next was so bizarre that Finney wasn't sure if it was real or hallucination, until Jane's arrest years later prompted her to come forward with her account. Finney recalled Jane climbing into her bed, caressing and kissing her while meticulously observing her deteriorating condition. This wasn't just about the thrill of killing. Jane was seeking intimate connection with her victims in their most vulnerable moments. She was literally embracing death, finding in these final moments the human connection that had been denied to her throughout her childhood. This disturbing intimacy between killer and victim reveals something profound about Jane's psychology. She wasn't just a cold-blooded killer. She was someone desperately seeking connection, but only able to find it through domination and control over others' mortality. Eventually, Jane left Cambridge Hospital. Whether due to growing suspicion or her own ambitions is unclear. She decided to pursue what she saw as a more profitable path: private nursing for affluent families. She secured a room in Cambridge and began advertising her services to wealthy clients. Jane demonstrated a clear preference for male patients over females, likely due to her need to feel authoritative and in control. Her demeanor was both cheerful and assertive, which contributed to her popularity among families desperate for reliable medical care for their loved ones. The Dunhams became her first confirmed victims outside the hospital setting. Jane resided at their Wendell Street home in Cambridge for several years. Mr. Dunham was elderly, frail, and admittedly difficult to care for. Jane later claimed she thought a small dose of morphine might help him rest, but administered too strong a dose, leading to his prolonged unconsciousness and death on May 26, 1895. The attending physicians concluded heart failure was the cause. Jane continued living with Mrs. Dunham for 2 more years until the elderly woman's crankiness became, in Jane's words, increasingly bothersome. On September 19, 1897, Mrs. Dunham received the same morphine treatment as her husband, with the same fatal results. What's particularly chilling about these murders is their casual nature. These weren't crimes of passion or desperate acts for financial gain. Jane was simply eliminating inconveniences from her life, treating human beings as obstacles to her comfort and convenience. By 1900, Jane's killing had evolved from opportunistic experiments to calculated revenge. Her target was Elizabeth Brigham, her adoptive sister, the one person who had shown her genuine kindness in the Toppan household. Jane had harbored deep resentment toward Elizabeth, believing she had destroyed a will that would have left Jane a portion of the family estate. Whether this will ever existed remains unknown, but in Jane's mind, Elizabeth had robbed her of her rightful inheritance. The opportunity came during the summer of 1900, while Jane was staying with the Davis family at their cottage in Catamount on Buzzards Bay. When Elizabeth came to visit, Jane finally had her chance for revenge. This murder was different from the others. This wasn't experimentation or convenience. This was pure malice. Jane tampered with Elizabeth's mineral water to inflict painful symptoms, then added morphine. Unlike her usual quick deaths, Jane deliberately made Elizabeth's death slow and agonizing. Jane later confessed that she watched Elizabeth struggle with twisted satisfaction, relishing every moment of her suffering. But something unexpected happened. When Elizabeth finally died, Jane was struck by a chill of horror and dismay. She hadn't yet become completely inured to the emotions of witnessing such prolonged suffering. This moment of conscience, if we can call it that, led Jane to resolve that she would make future deaths more peaceful. It's a fascinating glimpse into her psychology. Even in her depravity, she was capable of recognizing and being disturbed by excessive cruelty. By the summer of 1901, Jane faced a serious problem. She owed the Davis family $500 in unpaid cottage rental fees, a substantial sum for the time. The Davis family consisted of parents and 2 adult daughters who had become close to Jane over 5 consecutive summers of hosting her. Jane's solution was as simple as it was horrifying: eliminate the entire family. From June to August 1901, Jane systematically murdered all 4 members of the Davis family. This wasn't random killing. This was the calculated elimination of witnesses and creditors. Jane was essentially committing financial fraud through mass murder, wiping out her debts by wiping out the people she owed. The methodical nature of these killings demonstrates how completely Jane had lost any connection to human empathy. These weren't strangers in a hospital ward. These were people who had welcomed her into their home, treated her as family, trusted her with their lives. After the murders, Jane returned to her childhood home, where 60-year-old Oramel Brigham, Elizabeth's widower, still lived. Jane had set her sights on marrying Oramel and finally becoming the mistress of the home where she had grown up as an unwanted servant. But there was one more obstacle in her path. When Jane arrived at Oramel's home on August 24th, she was dismayed to find his elderly sister, Edna Bannister, staying there. Even though Edna planned to leave in just a few days, Jane couldn't wait. Within 3 days of her arrival, Edna was dead. The same doctor who had certified the housekeeper's death earlier now certified Edna's death as heart disease. Jane had successfully eliminated what she saw as the final obstacle to her marriage plans. But Jane's dreams of finally belonging somewhere were about to crumble. Despite her efforts to win Oramel's affection through exceptional housekeeping and care, he made it brutally clear that he had no intention of marrying her or even keeping her as a permanent housekeeper. Desperate, Jane resorted to increasingly erratic behavior. She poisoned Oramel with a non-lethal dose to make him ill, then nursed him back to health, hoping to demonstrate her indispensability. When that failed, she threatened to destroy his reputation by claiming he had made her pregnant. On September 29th, Oramel ordered her out of his house. Faced with yet another rejection, another abandonment, Jane overdosed on morphine and had to be hospitalized. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, authorities had finally grown suspicious about the sudden deaths of the entire Davis family and Jane's proximity to them. They exhumed the bodies and sent samples to Harvard Medical School for examination. By late October 1901, the autopsy results were in, revealing lethal amounts of arsenic in the exhumed bodies. A Massachusetts state detective had been assigned to monitor Jane's movements, and when she was discharged from the hospital, he followed her to Amherst, New Hampshire, where she went to stay with her friend Sarah Nichols and her brother George. On October 29, 1901, Jane Toppan was arrested and charged with the murder of Minnie Gibbs, the married daughter of the Davis family. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Initially, it seemed Jane might escape justice. Letters flooded in from former patients and colleagues praising her exceptional nursing skills and compassionate nature. The funeral home even defended her, pointing out that their embalming process involved large amounts of arsenic, which could explain the autopsy findings. But then the prosecution revealed a crucial detail. Jane didn't use arsenic for her murders. She used morphine and atropine, and traces of these drugs were found in the victims' remains. The defense crumbled, and Jane's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Jane began to confess, not just to the Davis murders, but to decades of killing that spanned her entire nursing career. Jane's confessions were unlike anything authorities had ever heard. She didn't express remorse or try to justify her actions. Instead, she spoke with chilling matter-of-factness about her methods and motivations. She estimated killing at least 31 people, though investigators suspected the true number was much higher. "It would be safe to say that I was more than fond of killing people," Jane told her interrogators. She described the voluptuous delight she experienced while watching her victims die, standing by their bedsides and observing every detail of their final moments. Jane revealed that she never feared the ghosts of her victims, never encountered any supernatural consequences for her actions. After Minnie Gibbs's death, she had calmly taken the woman's pocketbook containing a $10 gold coin, feeling no remorse or fear of spiritual retribution. Her confessions painted a picture of a woman completely disconnected from normal human emotion, someone who had found in murder the power and control that had been denied to her throughout her life. Jane Toppan was ultimately declared not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of her life in a mental institution. Her case challenged everything society believed about women and murder, proving that the capacity for evil isn't limited by gender or social expectations. What makes Jane Toppan's story so disturbing isn't just the number of people she killed, but the intimate nature of her crimes. She didn't kill from a distance or in moments of rage. She killed while providing care, often lying in bed with her victims as they died, seeking connection through their final moments. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear the most benevolent masks, that those entrusted with our care in our most vulnerable moments might harbor unimaginable darkness. Jane Toppan found in murder what she had never found in life: complete control over another human being, the ultimate expression of power over life and death. The little Irish orphan who was never truly wanted anywhere finally found her place in history, though not as the beloved nurse she pretended to be, but as one of America's most prolific serial killers. Her legacy remains a stark warning about the monsters that can hide behind healing hands and gentle smiles. If you want to know more about Jane Toppan's chilling confessions, the psychology behind her crimes, and other cases of medical murder, download the Skoob app on the App Store or Google Play to unlock the full experience. Thank you for walking with me through the dark corridors of history's most unsettling crimes. Remember, monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they wear a smile and carry a stethoscope. Until next time, this has been Serial Killer Files. Sleep lightly, and if someone calls themselves Jolly, you might want to ask why.